In every war, there are stories too dark to tell, archives too dangerous to open, and discoveries that make even the victors afraid to remember. The Second World War was not only a conflict of armies, but of intellect, where laboratories became new front lines and curiosity was twisted into a weapon. Behind the familiar images of soldiers and flags lay another battlefield hidden beneath the sound of engines and marching boots. A world of sealed rooms, coded reports, and experiments conducted in silence. Historians describe a pattern: documents marked restricted, pages missing from official ledgers, test sites erased from maps. Some of these files would never see daylight until decades later, when fragments began to surface in forgotten warehouses and declassified archives. What they revealed was not new technology or strategy, but the moral abyss that opens when science loses its conscience. In one surviving note, a military physician wrote that progress required sacrifice, but never defined whose sacrifice he meant. That single sentence has haunted researchers ever since. The more we read, the clearer it becomes that these experiments were not accidents of war, but deliberate ventures into forbidden knowledge. As we unlock these doors together, remember this is not horror for spectacle, but truth for remembrance. Viewer discretion is advised. This story is educational, drawn from historical records, and aims to preserve awareness, not to glorify suffering. The room of history is finally open, and inside it, the shadows still breathe. When the war ended, the world celebrated liberation. Yet among the crowds of returning soldiers, there were names missing. Scientists who had quietly disappeared before the ink of surrender had dried. Some had been leaders of research divisions, others anonymous technicians known only by initials in lab notes. Historians believe that in the chaos of collapsing regimes, they erased their own traces, taking with them notebooks and data that governments had ordered destroyed. The hunt for these vanished minds became an obsession for Allied intelligence. Teams scoured ruins, interrogated captured officers, and raided medical institutes still smoldering from bombardment. What they found was strange. Rows of empty filing cabinets, fragments of coded formulas, and half-burned photographs of medical chambers that should never have existed. Rumors spread of secret transports moving personnel across borders. Scientists offered immunity in exchange for their knowledge. To some, these men were criminals. To others, assets too valuable to lose. In this moral fog, accountability dissolved. The world had entered a new race, not of armies, but of information. And the line between justice and pragmatism blurred like ink on wet paper. As the names vanished, so did the evidence, leaving behind only questions. Who were they serving? What had they built? And what price would the world pay for the knowledge that survived their disappearance? Decades after the guns fell silent, an archivist in a small European university stumbled upon a box misfiled under weather research. Inside were documents so fragile that the air itself seemed to threaten them. Each page bore a red seal marked "Top Secret Physiological Testing." The archivist alerted authorities, and soon historians, ethicists, and journalists gathered to decipher the forgotten contents. What they found were fragments, temperature charts, pulse data, handwritten remarks about response thresholds. No names, only numbers. The tone was detached, almost mechanical, as if written by someone who had long stopped seeing the subjects as human. One report ended with the phrase, "Terminated, insufficient endurance," followed by a date and signature. To the untrained eye, it might look like a scientific record. To anyone else, it was a ledger of suffering disguised as research. Yet even here, we must tread carefully. The purpose of revisiting these papers is not to shock, but to understand how easily knowledge can be corrupted when stripped of empathy. Historians suggest that these files were preserved not by accident, but by defiance. Someone inside the system wanted the truth to outlive its perpetrators. Each fragile sheet is now a mirror reflecting the cost of obedience to ideology. They remain unread by most, sealed in climate-controlled vaults, waiting for a world mature enough to face what it once allowed to happen in the name of progress. Before we move further, it is important to remember that this documentary examines events through verified historical documentation. The scenes described here are reconstructed from official testimonies, medical logs, and declassified archives. Viewer discretion is advised. This content is educational, intended to preserve understanding of the ethical boundaries that were broken during one of humanity's darkest hours. When we speak of the experiments that followed, we do not do so for spectacle, but for reflection. Imagine a world where progress outruns morality, where curiosity no longer answers to conscience. That was the world of wartime science. Governments competing for survival gave scientists unprecedented freedom, and that freedom, unchecked, grew into something monstrous. Some records describe a chilling neutrality. The experimenters wrote in precise language, as though documenting weather patterns, never emotion. To them, the test subjects were data points, the suffering invisible behind statistical tables. This cold language is what makes the archives so haunting. The absence of cruelty becomes its own evidence of it. As we proceed, we must view these events through two lenses, one of history and one of responsibility. For to forget what was done in those hidden laboratories is to risk repeating it. What follows is not legend, not rumor, but the echo of real choices made by real people in pursuit of knowledge that should have never been sought. There is a moment in every civilization when knowledge begins to outgrow conscience. In the late 1930s, that moment arrived quietly, in laboratories hidden behind the rhetoric of national progress. Scientists, once guided by curiosity and healing, began answering not to patients, but to generals. Funding poured in, secrecy increased, and a new vocabulary emerged: efficiency, endurance, optimization. Behind these neutral words lurked an idea that knowledge itself could be purified of morality. It was a tempting illusion. When researchers were told that their duty was to serve the nation, not humanity, the boundary between discovery and destruction started to dissolve. Historians describe this as the shadow of knowledge, a state where intellect operates without empathy. In surviving records, scientists wrote of human limits as if they were merely numbers to be tested. The results would, they said, advance medicine. But progress without ethics is a form of blindness. The laboratories grew darker, the data grew colder, and soon even the language of compassion disappeared from the reports. Every civilization that worships efficiency eventually meets this shadow. What makes these experiments so haunting is not only what they did, but how easily they were justified. As we step into the next chapter, the question becomes clear. When science learns to serve ideology, can it still claim to serve truth? Among the first classified programs were the high-altitude experiments, designed to understand how the human body reacts to extreme pressure loss. Officially, they were meant to aid pilots and rescue missions. In reality, historians believe they became tests of endurance that ignored every ethical boundary. Surviving blueprints show large chambers lined with steel, capable of simulating the thin air at 30,000 feet. Records describe rapid decompression sequences and oxygen deprivation monitored minute by minute. The participants were not volunteers, though the documents never named them directly. Instead, they were referred to by code numbers, their identities erased before the tests even began. Technicians recorded pulse rates, body temperature, and brain response as though they were studying machines. One line in a recovered log reads, "Subject unresponsive at 14 minutes. Observation continued." That simple phrase captures the moral vacuum in which these trials occurred. There is no emotion, no empathy, only procedure. It is said that even some of the assistants questioned the purpose, but were told that such data could save pilots' lives. This was the cold arithmetic of wartime logic: sacrifice the few to protect the many. But who decides whose lives are worth the exchange? The altitude chambers became silent monuments to that question. And even today, the air inside them seems to echo with what was taken in the name of progress. When historians later examined the files, one detail stood out: the precision of the handwriting. Every line of data was beautifully neat, every number written with care. The scientists behind the experiments were not chaotic monsters. They were organized, disciplined, and convinced of their purpose. That is what makes their story so disturbing. They believed they were advancing the frontier of medicine. To them, ethics were luxuries of peace. Under orders, they rationalized each procedure as necessary, each subject as expendable. The lead researcher, whose name appears only once before being redacted, wrote that the pursuit of pure science demanded emotional detachment. It is easy to imagine the scene: a laboratory silent except for the hum of pumps, men in uniforms noting results while outside the world burns. When the war ended, many of these individuals defended their actions by claiming obedience to superior command. Yet history shows that the line between obedience and ambition is thin. Some continued their careers in other nations, protected by governments eager for their expertise. Their reports became textbooks, stripped of origin, cited without context. The irony is unbearable. Knowledge gained through suffering now reappearing as academic reference. The men behind the data are long gone, but the question they leave behind still challenges every researcher today. Can the pursuit of truth ever justify the abandonment of humanity? In the frozen regions of wartime Europe, another program sought to understand survival in extreme cold. The aim was to develop techniques for rescuing soldiers who crashed into icy waters. Yet the experiments quickly crossed the line between research and cruelty. Declassified documents described chilled immersion tanks where temperature, duration, and pulse were meticulously logged. Observers recorded the stages of hypothermia, measuring reaction times as body heat drained away. None of the reports mentioned pain, only loss of coordination or decrease in cognitive function. This detachment transforms the unimaginable into statistics. Historians believe these chambers were constructed near air bases, hidden beneath camouflage nets, their existence denied even to other branches of the military. In one memo, an officer praises the discipline of the medical team, noting that emotional hesitation had been eliminated. The phrase reveals everything. Emotion was seen as weakness, compassion as inefficiency. And yet, within that sterile environment, small traces of humanity still appear. A misplaced note, a correction in the margin, a sentence crossed out mid-line, as though the writer could no longer continue. Those fragments remind us that conscience cannot be fully erased. Every thermometer reading, every line of data represents not only a physical state, but a moral one. The freezing chambers may have been intended to strengthen armies, but in truth, they exposed the fragility of the human soul. When the war reached its peak, the laboratories began to operate with a singular obsession: data. Reports from multiple archives show how every decision, every command, reduced human life to a variable. The phrase, "data above life," appeared repeatedly in internal correspondence. It captured the mindset of an age that mistook precision for morality. Inside the sealed chambers, technicians adjusted controls with calm efficiency, while outside the world tore itself apart. They wrote of subject endurance and termination intervals, as if describing machinery rather than people. One historian remarked that the tragedy of these documents lies in their tone. They sound so rational that readers must remind themselves what those numbers mean. The scientists believed they were serving a greater cause, that truth demanded sacrifice. Yet they ignored that truth built on suffering becomes a lie. In one recovered note, a researcher argued that compassion interfered with accuracy. That single line, more than any graphic image, reveals how intellect can be twisted into obedience. After the war, some of these data sets were cited in post-war medical studies. Few questioned their origin at the time. Progress had become a kind of amnesia, a convenient forgetting. Only later would the world realize that beneath the charts and tables lay a silent cemetery of unacknowledged lives. The numbers remain, perfectly organized, perfectly cold, forever asking the same question. What is knowledge worth when it costs the right to call ourselves human? Every experimenter faces a line they swear never to cross. During the war, that line vanished, erased by orders that promised salvation through science. The dilemma was not just moral, but existential. If refusal meant death, obedience became survival. Diaries found after the war reveal internal conflict among the researchers. Some expressed unease, others rationalized that their work could save lives in the future. It was the ancient temptation of ends over means. In one passage, a doctor writes that he dreamed of the people he studied but could not see their faces. Guilt and duty fused into paralysis. The modern reader might wonder why none refused, but the machinery of authority was designed precisely to make refusal impossible. It rewarded silence and punished empathy. Historians describe how this atmosphere created what they call collective detachment, a state where responsibility dissolved into hierarchy. Each participant claimed they were following someone else's orders, and in that chain of obedience, morality disappeared. After the war, the few survivors who testified spoke of how the scientists avoided eye contact, how they treated the aftermath like a calculation to be solved. The experimenter's dilemma is not confined to that era. It still echoes in every debate about technology and power. When knowledge demands the suspension of conscience, the question is not whether we will achieve progress, but whether we will survive it. In the ruins of a medical research complex in Central Europe, Allied investigators discovered a cache of blueprints rolled inside a steel cylinder. Each sheet was drawn with meticulous precision, depicting chambers, control panels, and equipment labeled physiological unit. At first, the officers thought they were looking at aircraft parts. Only later did medical specialists realize they had found the designs for human experimentation facilities. The blueprints became evidence, but also symbols of how science had been weaponized. Every detail, the placement of gauges, the notes on oxygen flow, the calibration tables, spoke of a mind that prized control above compassion. Historians describe the discovery as the moment when the world finally confronted the full scale of these operations. The investigators photographed everything, cataloged the materials, and sent them to war crime tribunals. Some documents were later classified again, considered too sensitive for public release. Even today, parts of those files remain sealed. The irony is haunting. Knowledge once hidden for secrecy became hidden again for shame. Yet those fragile blueprints, preserved in archives, are now studied by ethicists as cautionary relics. They remind us that precision without purpose is empty, that innovation detached from morality is indistinguishable from destruction. Every line on those pages once represented faith in science. Now they serve as a warning written in ink and silence. As the war ended, a new competition began. Not over territory, but over knowledge. The Allied forces moved quickly to seize laboratories, documents, and personnel before their rivals could reach them. In this clandestine race, morality became negotiable. Operation teams from multiple nations entered occupied zones, offering immunity in exchange for scientific data. Many of the very scientists who had conducted the forbidden experiments found themselves courted by the victors. To one side, they were criminals. To another, assets in the emerging struggle of ideologies. Records reveal that entire archives were shipped overseas under coded operations. Historians call it the harvest of knowledge, a phrase that conceals the ethical rot beneath. Governments justified these actions as necessary to prevent adversaries from gaining advantage. But in doing so, they absorbed the same logic that had birthed the experiments: progress above principle. Some of the data resurfaced in post-war research, stripped of context and citation. The world's thirst for advancement had overpowered its capacity for remorse. This was the beginning of a silence more complex than denial. A silence constructed from gratitude toward forbidden knowledge. The race to possess the research ensured that the moral reckoning would be delayed for decades, buried under layers of bureaucracy and ambition. It is a reminder that victory does not always cleanse guilt. Sometimes it simply inherits it. When the dust of war settled, the victors began a quiet campaign that history would later call Operation Paper Shadows. Under this program, hundreds of scientists once tied to wartime research were relocated to new nations under new names. Their pasts were erased by ink and bureaucracy, their crimes diluted into contributions. Officially, it was about safeguarding technological advantage. Yet privately, it was about control. Who would own the future shaped by forbidden knowledge? Planes departed in the night carrying men who had once overseen experiments that defied every moral boundary. Some arrived in the United States, others in the Soviet Union, each welcomed not as criminals, but as prizes. Governments justified it as pragmatism, arguing that the knowledge itself was innocent, only its use corrupt. But knowledge cannot be divorced from the hands that shaped it. Decades later, declassified memos revealed the extent of this trade. Laboratories reopened, research continued under new banners, and the same data once condemned in tribunals became the foundation of modern aerospace and medical research. Historians debate whether this transfer of intellect saved humanity or damned its conscience. What is certain is that Operation Paper Shadows blurred the distinction between justice and utility, between memory and amnesia. The shadow of those flights still stretches across scientific institutions today, a reminder that the past does not vanish when it becomes useful. It simply changes uniform. In the aftermath of discovery came the promise of justice. The world watched as tribunals assembled to confront the crimes committed under the banner of research. Yet even in those chambers, truth struggled against politics. Testimonies were delivered in calm monotone, filled with phrases like scientific necessity and following orders. The judges demanded moral clarity, but the defendants offered only technical explanations. Witnesses described instruments, procedures, and charts, but few could describe remorse. Historians who studied the transcripts later noted the language of evasion. A constant deflection of responsibility, a refusal to say the simple words, "We were wrong." Some scientists claimed they were compelled by the state. Others argued that their work advanced medicine. In the end, many sentences were light, some charges dismissed. The world was eager to rebuild, not dwell on guilt. But the moral stain lingered. Decades later, ethicists would refer to these hearings as the moment humanity learned how fragile accountability could be when tangled with ambition. The tribunals documented every fact, yet facts alone could not restore dignity to the lost. The paradox of justice is that it can record truth without ever healing it. As the gavel fell and the lights dimmed, the world promised never again. But promises, like archives, are only as strong as the will to keep them. In remote valleys and forested hills, the remnants of forgotten laboratories still stand, half buried beneath moss and time. Their concrete walls, once sealed against the world, now crumble under the weight of silence. Occasionally, explorers stumble upon fragments, metal instruments, faded diagrams, shards of glass etched with calibration marks. Local legends whisper that these places are haunted, not by spirits, but by the memory of what knowledge cost. When historians excavated one of these sites, they found a ledger sealed in Wakamasasin. The pages contained only numbers and short notes. Yet the final line read, "Purpose fulfilled." It was a chilling end to a record of suffering disguised as achievement. These ruins serve as a physical reminder of the arrogance that accompanies secrecy. During the war, they were symbols of progress. Now they are memorials of caution. In their silence lies an unspoken warning that what begins as research can end as ritual when guided by ideology. Each brick tells a story of ambition without empathy, of intellect without restraint. Modern scientists who visit these ruins describe a strange sensation, as if the walls themselves are watching, asking whether humanity has truly changed. The laboratories may have been forgotten by the world, but the world still lives within their shadow. Every archive has its absences, every record its silence. For all the reports, photographs, and testimonies that survived, the most important voices are the ones we will never hear. They belong to those who endured the experiments and never returned. Their stories were erased by procedure, their names replaced with numbers, their humanity reduced to margins of data. Historians have tried to reconstruct fragments of their lives through letters, census lists, and whispered accounts from witnesses. One letter, found folded inside a confiscated coat, reads simply, "If I do not come back, tell them I was more than a subject." That single sentence carries the weight of thousands. The tragedy of the experiments is not only what was done, but how little the world listened afterward. For decades, survivors who did live carried invisible scars, often dismissed or silenced by societies eager to move forward. It is only through their persistence that the full scope of the atrocity became known. When we speak of data and progress, we must also speak of them. Each breath they took within those chambers was an act of resistance, proof that even in captivity, dignity endures. Their silence is not emptiness. It is the echo of what humanity must remember if it wishes never to repeat what it once forgot. Among the scattered papers left behind after the war were letters never meant for history. They were personal notes written by those inside the laboratories, messages that reveal the rare moments when the mask of professionalism slipped. One letter found in a rusted drawer begins with the line, "To whoever finds this, I want you to know that I once believed in reason." The writer describes his early faith in science, his hope that discovery would bring order to a chaotic world. But by the end of the page, his tone changes. He confesses that the pursuit of progress had turned into something he no longer recognized. He writes of watching his own hands record data that felt like betrayal, of realizing that knowledge without empathy is another form of blindness. Many of these letters end abruptly, as if their authors feared discovery or could not bear to continue. Historians believe they were hidden on purpose, acts of quiet rebellion within systems built on silence. Each letter bridges the gap between the sterile reports and the human beings who created them, showing that even among those complicit, conscience still flickered. These fragments remind us that the story of wartime science is not a tale of monsters, but of ordinary people who allowed themselves to forget what it means to feel. In their words, we hear not justification, but the faint echo of regret, a plea for forgiveness written in the language of reason. Years after the conflict ended, some of the scientists who had participated in wartime research began to speak. Not many, but enough to reveal the complexity of guilt. Their interviews, conducted in secret or published under aliases, show a shared theme of disillusionment. One doctor admitted that he had convinced himself he was saving lives, only to realize that he had merely learned to measure suffering. Another confessed that he could no longer enter a hospital without remembering the laboratories where he had once worked. These were not heroic confessions, but haunted ones. Their remorse came too late for the victims, yet their testimonies exposed how ideology can deform conscience until only emptiness remains. One particularly chilling interview ends with the words, "I discovered that the line between scientist and executioner is thinner than we think." These statements, preserved in archives, were used in ethics courses decades later, not to condemn, but to warn. They illustrate how easily self-deception can become policy when authority demands obedience. The doctors who regretted left behind more than guilt. They left a lesson about the danger of believing that purpose justifies every method. They remind us that repentance after harm is only meaningful if it changes the living. Their stories do not cleanse the past, but they force us to face it with the humility that those before us lacked. Progress is a word that once promised salvation, yet in the wake of war it became a whisper carrying the weight of sorrow. The same nations that had celebrated their scientific triumphs soon discovered that some achievements came from places too dark to mention. Laboratories were rebuilt, journals reopened, and a new generation of researchers stepped forward. But beneath their optimism lay a silence carefully maintained. Governments avoided discussing the origins of certain data, universities cited results without context, and textbooks simplified what had been too complicated to justify. Historians call this period the Quiet Reconstruction, a time when truth was archived under layers of pragmatism. The irony is cruel. Humanity learned more about the human body during those years than ever before. Yet it also learned how to hide the cost of that knowledge. Museums displayed artifacts of progress while locking away the evidence of its price. Survivors who tried to speak often found their testimonies ignored, their pain inconvenient for a world eager to rebuild. In that silence, progress became illusion, a facade meant to cover the absence of empathy. When progress turns to silence, knowledge becomes hollow, and memory becomes exile. Only by breaking that silence can civilization reclaim the moral ground it once surrendered to ambition. Decades after the war, when the archives finally opened and the fear of reprisal faded, survivors began to speak. Their words transformed abstract history into living truth. Many were frail, their voices trembling as they recalled what had been done in the name of science. They spoke of rooms that smelled of metal and disinfectant, of questions they did not understand, of the feeling that their suffering was being measured like a formula. Each testimony was a confrontation with disbelief. For years, people had thought such cruelty impossible, but the survivors described it with the precision of memory that refuses to fade. Some historians wept while transcribing their interviews, not because of the pain described, but because of the strength required to relive it. These testimonies shattered the illusion that time heals all wounds. They proved that some wounds never close. They only teach us to listen. The survivors demanded no revenge, only recognition. Their words became the moral compass of post-war ethics, guiding laws that now define human rights. When they spoke, the world finally heard the heartbeat beneath the statistics, the humanity buried beneath reports. Their voices remind us that remembrance is not a ritual of grief, but an act of resistance against forgetting. To listen is to ensure that what happened in silence will never be allowed to return to it. When the war ended, the victors stood before a terrible paradox. What should be done with the information gathered through suffering? Governments debated whether it was moral to destroy data that could save future lives, or immoral to use it at all. In secret, the answer was already being written. Reports once sealed as evidence were quietly circulated among research institutes. Diagrams of pressure chambers, tables of hypothermic responses, and chemical exposure results appeared in studies under sanitized titles. The data was stripped of origin, its creators unnamed, its victims erased. Historians discovered that some of these records were cited in post-war aviation medicine and extreme temperature research. The justification was utilitarian. If lives could be preserved, the data must be used. Yet this logic repeated the same reasoning that had created the experiments in the first place. Knowledge had become a relic too valuable to ignore and too shameful to acknowledge. Scientists argued over ethics, while bureaucrats redacted pages, transforming horror into statistics. The cold knowledge survived not because it deserved to, but because humanity could not resist the temptation of progress. The most unsettling truth is that fragments of it still exist in academic archives, referenced indirectly, their lineage disguised. In this quiet reuse, history achieved the cruelest form of immortality, the continuation of discovery built upon silence. The years that followed saw the migration of minds across continents. Scientists who had once served empires now worked for democracies, dictatorships, or private corporations, each claiming to represent a new beginning. Their reputations were cleansed through the language of necessity. Some helped design space programs, others advanced pharmaceuticals, their wartime pasts reduced to footnotes. Historians examining declassified employment files found entire sections missing, erased to facilitate reintegration. The world that had condemned them now depended on their expertise. It was a strange redemption, one earned not through repentance but through relevance. These scientists lived in quiet anonymity, building futures while evading the ghosts of the past. Their new laboratories gleamed with modern equipment, yet the moral questions remained buried under polished steel. One memoir written decades later reveals a haunting confession. "I never escaped the laboratory. I only changed its flag." That line captures the truth behind post-war reinvention. Progress has no loyalty, and knowledge wears any uniform offered to it. The scientists in new nations proved that history does not always punish those who crossed its boundaries. Sometimes it rewards them. Their presence within modern institutions serves as both warning and mirror, showing that civilization often trades morality for convenience and calls it renewal. Modern medicine owes much to the lessons of the past, yet among its foundations lie traces of darkness. Some of the techniques refined during the war evolved into modern treatments, stripped of their origins and rebranded as innovations. Medical ethics committees now reference those atrocities as the reason for new codes and declarations. But the irony remains. The suffering that should have halted progress instead accelerated it. Historians describe this as medicine's dark inheritance, a legacy both educational and burdensome. Hospitals today operate with protocols of consent and oversight precisely because of what was once violated. The very rules protecting patients are monuments to those who had none. Yet there is unease in acknowledging that modern benefits can arise from immoral beginnings. Can humanity ever truly separate the knowledge from the cruelty that produced it? Ethical philosophers argue that the only redemption lies in remembrance, to use the knowledge responsibly while never allowing its origin to be forgotten. Every medical student who studies physiology or survival in extreme conditions unknowingly walks in the shadow of experiments that once desecrated those same principles. The past lingers not in the laboratories themselves, but in the questions they left behind. Can healing truly grow from harm, and does remembrance absolve the sin or only keep it alive? By the late 20th century, the world sought to codify what conscience had failed to prevent. International declarations on human rights and medical ethics were drafted, their language precise, their purpose solemn. The Nuremberg Code became a cornerstone, followed by the Declaration of Helsinki and countless institutional review boards. These were not just legal documents, they were moral barricades built from the ruins of betrayal. Each clause carried the weight of those who could no longer speak, ensuring that consent, dignity, and compassion would never again be treated as optional. Yet history shows that these protections are only as strong as the memory sustaining them. Ethical boundaries erode when comfort replaces vigilance. In moments of crisis, even modern nations have tested the limits, invoking necessity once more. The lesson of the past is not merely that ethics must exist, but that they must be lived, renewed daily through awareness and humility. When researchers today sign consent forms or attend ethics briefings, they participate in a ritual of remembrance, an acknowledgement of the price paid for knowledge. These lessons in ethics were written not in ink, but in loss, and they ask each generation the same quiet question. If progress demands forgetting, is it progress at all? Across Europe and Asia, there are museums that do not advertise themselves with banners or bright lights. They are quiet, gray buildings tucked between streets of progress, their walls heavy with the air of things that should never have happened. Inside them, glass cases hold relics that seem ordinary. Medical instruments, faded documents, fragments of uniforms. But each object carries the weight of human suffering turned into data. Visitors speak in whispers, as if their voices might disturb the ghosts that linger in the corridors. Curators call these places the museums of silence. Their purpose is not to display horror, but to make absence visible. To remind those who enter that history is not just written in triumph, but also in shame. Every plaque, every exhibit tells a story without adjectives, leaving the viewer to fill in what the text cannot say. There is no dramatization, only the sterile calm of truth that refuses to fade. Historians argue that these spaces are humanity's conscience materialized in stone. They are sanctuaries of acknowledgement, where remembrance replaces judgment. The silence inside them is deliberate. It forces confrontation without spectacle. When one stands before a simple pair of spectacles, recovered from a laboratory long dismantled, one understands that remembrance is not about preserving artifacts, but about preserving empathy. These museums do not ask for tears. They ask for awareness, a quiet promise that such rooms will never again be built under any flag or ideology. History has a peculiar habit of reflecting the present back to those who dare to look. Each generation believes it is different from the one before, yet the same patterns repeat in subtler forms. In the glow of modern laboratories and the hum of new technology, echoes of the past still whisper. The justifications have changed. Nationalism replaced by innovation, survival replaced by efficiency. But the temptation remains the same: to pursue progress faster than ethics can follow. When historians describe the wartime experiments, they are not simply recounting what was done, but warning what can be done again. The mirror of history shows that moral failure often begins not with cruelty, but with indifference. It begins with words like necessary, temporary, unavoidable. Those words built the chambers of the past and continue to build the compromises of the present. To look into history's mirror is to recognize that the capacity for darkness is not confined to one nation or one era. It lives in every society that values results over responsibility. The reflection is uncomfortable because it reveals that what we condemn in others, we sometimes excuse in ourselves. And yet, this discomfort is the very point of remembrance. It forces vigilance, humility, and the courage to ask whether progress has truly learned compassion or merely changed its language. Time is both healer and thief. As decades pass, the sharp edges of memory soften, and what was once unbearable becomes distant, then abstract. The danger lies in mistaking fading memory for forgiveness. Across the world, younger generations walk through those silent museums with curiosity rather than grief. They see artifacts, but not experiences, statistics, but not souls. Survivors' voices grow quieter each year, replaced by textbook summaries and digital archives. Historians warn that when memory fades, history becomes myth, and myth can be reshaped into whatever the present desires. Already there are those who question whether the experiments were exaggerated, who reinterpret evidence through the lens of skepticism rather than empathy. Forgetting does not happen through malice, but through comfort. The comfort of believing that humanity has outgrown its capacity for cruelty. Yet the records remain, fragile but unyielding, testifying against forgetfulness. Each generation must choose whether to remember actively or let memory decay into silence. True remembrance is not nostalgia, it is responsibility. To keep memory alive is to accept its burden, to confront the discomfort that ensures our moral pulse continues to beat. When memory fades, history risks repeating not because evil returns stronger, but because conscience returns weaker. Knowledge has always demanded a price, but rarely has it been counted so painfully as in the aftermath of these experiments. What humanity gained in data, it lost in innocence. The war taught us that curiosity without conscience is a weapon more dangerous than any bomb. Every discovery since then carries an unspoken question: at what cost? Scientists today work under codes of ethics designed to prevent another descent, yet the temptation to push boundaries persists. The drive to understand, to surpass, to control remains embedded in the human spirit. The price of knowing is not only what was endured, but what must be remembered. To know is to bear witness, to acknowledge that progress cannot be measured solely in results, but in the humanity preserved along the way. Philosophers argue that knowledge divorced from morality is not enlightenment, but infection. It spreads, replicates, and erodes empathy until nothing remains but efficiency. The price of knowing, then, is eternal vigilance, the constant awareness that every discovery carries with it the potential to harm. The survivors paid the first debt, and the living must pay the rest through remembrance. Understanding the past is not an academic pursuit. It is an act of preservation for the soul of civilization itself. Every age conducts its own experiments, though not always in laboratories. Some are carried out in policy rooms, in markets, in the invisible calculations that measure worth and survival. The last experiment of the 20th century was not about altitude or temperature, but about memory itself. Whether humanity could remember pain without reliving it, whether truth could survive convenience. Historians argue that this is the final and most dangerous test, for forgetting is the gentlest form of destruction. In universities and conferences, experts still debate the boundary between knowledge and morality, citing past atrocities as lessons. But lessons fade when they become too familiar. What once terrified now feels historical, detached, almost safe. And that is how history repeats. Not through ignorance, but through the illusion of understanding. The last experiment continues quietly. Each time we choose comfort over truth, efficiency over empathy, or progress over responsibility. It asks no permission and leaves no record, only consequences. Perhaps the true legacy of the wartime laboratories is not the data they produced, but the reflection they demand. Each generation must decide whether to be subject or observer, whether to participate in the silence or to break it. The final experiment is not about discovering how far humanity can go. It is about discovering whether it can stop before it goes too far again. As the story returns to silence, the echoes of the past remain, faint yet unyielding. The war has ended. The laboratories are gone, but their shadow stretches across every institution that seeks power through knowledge. That shadow is not a curse. It is a reminder. It teaches that morality cannot be retrofitted, that conscience must exist before discovery, not after. The light of progress is bright, but it lengthens the darkness behind it. What defines a civilization is not what it knows, but what it refuses to do in pursuit of knowing more. In this truth lies both warning and hope. The warning is that the conditions that birthed those experiments, fear, obedience, ambition, still live within us. The hope is that awareness can outlast cruelty, that remembrance can prevent repetition. The shadow closes not as an ending, but as a cycle completed. We return to the locked room of history, the one we dared to open 60 minutes ago, and we realize that the key was never curiosity, but conscience. The files remain, sealed again, not by censorship, but by understanding. In their silence, we hear the cost of knowledge and the strength of remembrance. This is where the story ends, not in despair, but in vigilance. For every generation must decide how it will use the light it inherits, and what it is willing to keep in the shadows.